Welcome back, Truth Seekers. We all know BTS as untouchable global icons with dazzling smiles and record-breaking hits. But what happens when the stage lights go out and the deafening cheers fade into absolute silence? Are they truly the invincible superstars we see, or are they secretly carrying burdens too heavy for us to even imagine? Today, we are ripping off the glamorous masks to expose the raw, untold realities of the 7 members. Who is hiding a crushing insecurity behind a bright laugh, and whose secret struggle at rank number 1 will completely shatter your heart? Get ready, because once you know the truth, you will never look at them the same way again. Are you brave enough to find out? Number 7. J-Hope. The prisoner of eternal sunshine, the tears hidden in the rhythm, the silent scream behind the smile. Ladies and gentlemen, we start our countdown with the man who introduces himself as your hope, your angel, the literal human embodiment of dopamine, Jungkook, better known to the world as J-Hope. But have you ever stopped to wonder how heavy a burden it is to be the sun that never sets? We see the blinding megawatt smile that could power a city, the sound effects that fill the awkward silences during interviews, and the energetic dances that defy the laws of physics. Yet, if you peel back the layers of this vibrant persona, you find a narrative that is far more complex and heartbreakingly human than the caricature of happiness he often portrays. Before the glitz and the glamour, there was just a boy from Gwangju who lived and breathed street dance, known then as Smile Hoya, a name that eerily foreshadowed a destiny where his smile would become both his greatest weapon and his heaviest mask. And we need to talk about the sheer grit it took for him to even exist in this group, because unlike the others who were scouted for their voices or visuals, Hosak fought his way in through pure, unadulterated movement, spending hours in dark, sweaty studios until his muscles screamed and his bones ached, driving his body to the brink of collapse just to prove he belonged. But here is the twisted irony that many fans often overlook. J-Hope was not originally a rapper. He was a vocalist and a dancer who had to completely rewire his brain and artistic identity to fit the mold of BTS, sacrificing his original dream to support the team's structure, learning to rhyme and flow from scratch while hiding the immense insecurity of being the teacher of dance to members who had 2 left feet. A pressure cooker situation where he couldn't afford to be weak, because if the dance leader crumbled, the entire performance would fall apart. There is a legendary, heart-stopping story from their trainee days that truly exposes the fragility of his position, where J-Hope actually left the group, packing his bags to return to Gwangju because the uncertainty was suffocating. And it was the golden maknae Jungkook who cried and begged him to stay, while RM convinced the management that BTS simply could not debut without Jungkook. A moment that haunts the fandom because it shows just how close we came to a world without J-Hope, revealing that behind the confidence was a terrified young man ready to give up everything. Fast forward to their global domination, and the role of mood maker began to morph from a personality trait into a professional obligation, a golden cage where he felt he wasn't allowed to show exhaustion, sadness, or anger because the cameras were rolling and the world needed Hobie to be happy, creating a psychological dissonance between the character J-Hope and the human Jungkook that he later described as a Pandora's box he desperately needed to break open. This internal war came to a head with his solo album, Jack in the Box, a project that shocked the mainstream public because it wasn't the bubblegum pop or sunny hip-hop everyone expected, but rather a gritty, dark, grunge-filled scream into the void where he finally admitted that he was burned out, anxious about his future, and tired of pretending that everything was fine, using imagery of arson and ashes to symbolize burning down his old image to find his true self. Do you remember his historic headline set at Lollapalooza? While we saw a god of the stage commanding a sea of people, he later confessed in his documentary that he was paralyzed with fear, unable to eat or sleep, fighting a lonely battle against his own mind without his 6 brothers flanking him, proving that the bravest face often hides the most trembling heart. He is the member who notices when everyone else is down, the one who cleans up the messes, the emotional anchor who stabilizes the chaotic energy of the group. But who anchors the anchor when the waves get too high? The hidden side of J-Hope is not that he is secretly miserable, but that his happiness is a disciplined, exhausting choice he makes every single day for our sake. A sacrificial offering of his own emotional spectrum so that we only see the light while he quietly absorbs the darkness, leaving us to ask the chilling question: when the camera turns off and the smile drops, does Jungkook get to be comforted, or is he still just trying to be everyone else's hope?
Number 6. RM. The crushed shoulders of a leader, the genius trapped in a museum, a boy who forgot how to be young. When you look at Kim Namjoon, known globally as RM, you see the towering intellectual pillar of BTS, the eloquent speaker who commands the podium at the United Nations urging the youth to speak yourself, and the linguistic genius who single-handedly taught himself English by watching reruns of Friends. But what happens when the brain that built a multi-billion-dollar empire becomes a suffocating prison of endless anxiety and unbearable expectations? We need to travel back to the gritty, unforgiving underground hip-hop scene of South Korea, where a young, fiercely talented teenager named Runch Randa was spitting fire, battling veterans, and earning raw street respect, only to trade that hard-earned underground crown for a K-pop idol group's risky debut, a controversial decision that essentially slapped a massive target on his back and led to some of the most agonizing humiliation of his early career. Do you remember the infamous 2013 broadcast where underground rappers publicly mocked RM and Suga right to their faces, accusing them of selling out, wearing makeup, and betraying the sacred roots of hip-hop just to be manufactured puppets of the pop industry? Imagine the psychological torment of sitting there in silence, swallowing your immense pride and taking those verbal bullets head-on while knowing you are carrying the entire financial future of big hit entertainment and the dreams of 6 other vulnerable boys on your back. A devastating moment that forced RM to build a heavy armor of stoicism that he has rarely been able to take off since that fateful day. Furthermore, let us not forget the heartbreaking, deeply personal resistance he faced from his own family, hiding his handwritten lyrics in his school textbooks because his mother, desperate for him to use his genius-level IQ of 148 for a safe, prestigious academic career, would find and destroy his notebooks, forcing a young Namjoon to choose between the conditional approval of his parents and the burning, undeniable passion in his soul. A deep-seated guilt he carried for years as he fought tooth and nail to prove that his dangerous path into music was not a catastrophic mistake. As BTS miraculously skyrocketed to unprecedented, stratospheric global heights, that invisible armor he built only grew exponentially heavier, morphing from a necessary protective shell into a suffocating Iron Maiden. Because suddenly, he wasn't just an underground rapper or musician anymore. He was a diplomat, a global translator, a cultural ambassador for South Korea, and the definitive, flawless voice of the biggest musical act on the entire planet. Think about the agonizing, sweat-inducing pressure of those massive American press tours where RM was the sole member fluent in English, constantly scanning the chaotic room, frantically processing complex questions from foreign journalists, translating them in his head in milliseconds, formulating culturally appropriate and profound answers, and then quietly translating the other members' responses back to the interviewers, all while smiling flawlessly for the flashing cameras so the group wouldn't be maliciously perceived as ungrateful, ignorant, or unprepared. The mental gymnastics required to be the flawless, politically correct spokesperson while simultaneously battling his own crippling imposter syndrome is something straight out of a psychological thriller. A relentless, high-wire balancing act where one single wrong word, one misinterpreted phrase could trigger a massive global scandal, leaving him constantly hypervigilant and unable to ever truly let his guard down in public. He was playing three-dimensional chess in real time while the entire world scrutinized his every syllable. And in doing so, he slowly and tragically began to sacrifice Kim Namjoon, the fragile human being, at the altar of RM, the flawless, unbreakable leader. We see this profound, aching loneliness bleeding through the melancholic tracks of his solo mixtape, Mono, a deeply introspective, rain-soaked masterpiece that feels less like a traditional rap album and far more like a midnight confession from a man wandering completely alone through a sleeping city, desperately yearning for genuine human connection, but absolutely terrified of being truly perceived by the public eye. The raw lyrics expose a wounded soul torn apart by the tragic paradox of loving and hating the very city and industry that made him a global superstar, highlighting a profound, echoing isolation that extreme fame only magnified instead of cured. This relentless, grinding machine of perfectionism and self-sacrifice finally cracked wide open during the historically tearful 2022 Festa dinner, a raw, unscripted moment that sent absolute shockwaves through the fandom and the entire global music industry, where a visibly exhausted, tear-drenched RM confessed that the K-pop idol system leaves absolutely no time for you to mature as a human being, admitting through agonizing sobs that he had completely lost his artistic direction, didn't know what kind of message he wanted to send to the world anymore, and felt like a hollow, empty shell simply producing content on a never-ending corporate conveyor belt. It was a terrifyingly raw admission from a man whose entire public identity was built on having all the answers, revealing that the mastermind behind BTS's most profound, life-saving lyrics was secretly drowning in a massive existential crisis, desperately searching for meaning in a life that had become entirely owned by the public and the media. We must also deeply acknowledge the crushing weight of his profound intellect, because he is so deeply introspective, well-read, and hyper-aware of the world's tragedies. He feels the collective pain and anxiety of his generation on a magnified, unbearable scale, turning his beautiful lyricism into a bleeding, open wound that he constantly reopens for public consumption, exploring these raw scars in his monumental solo album, Indigo, where he boldly and desperately declares his desire to be a simple wildflower grounded in the quiet earth rather than a spectacular firework that flashes brilliantly for the masses only to quickly burn out and turn to forgotten dust in the dark sky. This is exactly why the phenomenon known as Namjooning, his famous solitary trips to quiet art galleries, deep forests, riding his bicycle alone along the Han River, and wandering aimlessly through empty, echoing museums, is not just a cute hobby or a carefully curated aesthetic for his Instagram feed, but rather a vital, desperate survival mechanism, a frantic, gasping attempt to reclaim a tiny fragment of silence in a deafening, chaotic world where he is constantly demanded to speak, lead, and inspire. He stands completely still in front of silent paintings and ancient sculptures because the blank canvas and the cold stone are the absolutely only things in his chaotic, high-stakes life that do not expect a profound statement, an uplifting quote, a perfectly translated interview, or a record-breaking global mega-hit. They simply allow him to exist as a quiet 20-something man looking at art without judgment, without expectations, and without the suffocating title of global icon. The heartbreaking, undeniable reality of number 6 is that Kim Namjoon voluntarily and silently gave up his youth, his right to be reckless, his right to make terrible mistakes, and his personal freedom to be the unbreakable intellectual shield for BTS and millions of armies, absorbing the heavy, devastating blows of a ruthless music industry so the other 6 members could shine a little brighter and fly a little higher, ultimately leading us to look at his gentle, dimpled smile and ask the chilling, desperately unanswered question, as he meticulously and flawlessly cares for the souls of his members and single-handedly carries the massive, crushing expectations of millions of fans across the entire globe.
Who is stepping up to protect the incredibly fragile, exhausted boy desperately hiding behind the invincible, lonely title of leader?
Number 5. Jin, the mask of worldwide handsome, the actor forced to sing, a sacrifice hidden in dad jokes. When the deafening roar of the stadium crowd erupts and the blinding stage lights finally focus, the very first thing that captures the world's attention is the breathtaking, mathematically flawless face of Kim Sig-jin, the man who confidently and shamelessly introduced himself to the entire globe as worldwide handsome, constantly blowing extravagant flying kisses to the cameras and cracking terrible, painfully cheesy dad jokes that make his younger bandmates groan in collective affectionate embarrassment. But have you ever paused for a single moment to look past that dazzling, seemingly impenetrable armor of unbreakable self-confidence to see the deeply insecure, terrified young man who spent years desperately trying to keep his head above water? We have to drastically rewind the clock to a much darker, uncertain time before the sold-out Wembley stadiums and the historic Grammy nominations, back to when Sig-jin was just an ordinary, devastatingly handsome acting student at the highly prestigious Jungkook University, a young man whose sole burning ambition was to become a respected, serious actor on the silver screen, who possessed absolutely zero background in singing, zero background in dancing, and frankly, zero intention of ever stepping foot into the brutal, hyper-competitive meat grinder that is the K-pop idol industry. Legend has it that he literally ran away from an SM Entertainment talent scout on the street because he genuinely thought it was a malicious scam, only to be cornered later by a relentless big-hit casting director who was completely mesmerized by his striking, otherworldly visuals as he casually stepped off a bus, essentially recruiting him not for his raw, unpolished musical talent, but simply because he had the face of a literal god, immediately throwing him headfirst into a brutal, unforgiving trainee system where he was entirely surrounded by terrifyingly gifted seasoned teenage prodigies like RM, Suga, and J-Hope, who breathed underground hip-hop, alongside natural-born, instinctual performers like Jimin, V, and Jungkook. Imagine for a second the sheer, crushing humiliation and the agonizing psychological toll of being the oldest trainee in the room, a proud 20-year-old man in a strict, rigidly age-hierarchical Korean society who suddenly had to start his entire life from below absolute zero, constantly being yelled at by strict, unforgiving instructors, clumsily tripping over his own 2 feet during grueling, endless dance practices, and painfully struggling to hit the most basic vocal notes, while the younger, more experienced boys literally ran laps around him in sheer, effortless talent. While the general public and the media initially saw him merely as the visual of the group, a title that is so often a thinly veiled derogatory insult in the K-pop industry, implying that you are just an empty, pretty face with absolutely no real artistic substance or musical worth, Sig-jin was secretly bleeding in the dark, staying behind in the suffocating, sweat-drenched dance studios long after the other exhausted members had collapsed into their cramped bunk beds, viciously and relentlessly repeating the exact same choreographies hundreds upon hundreds of times until his joints screamed in absolute agony and his muscles gave out, completely and utterly terrified of being the weak link that would selfishly drag his fiercely talented younger brothers down into failure. This profound, aching sense of inadequacy and quiet desperation birthed one of the most heartbreaking solo tracks in BTS's entire discography, the devastatingly beautiful Awake, where Jin painfully confesses through his soaring, tear-jerking vocals that he firmly believes he can never truly fly like the other 6 brilliant petals of his group, admitting with shattering honesty that he is simply holding out his fragile hands, walking and running alone in the dark, desperately trying to keep up with their blinding, meteoric light, while quietly accepting his own perceived limitations as a heartbreaking, inescapable reality.
But the true, devastating sacrifice of Kim Sek-jin is not just physical. It is a profound, incredibly calculated martyrdom that fundamentally and permanently glued BTS together as a family. Because in traditional Korean culture, the Mathyung, or the eldest brother, is strictly expected to be stern, authoritative, and demand absolute, unquestioning respect, a rigid, suffocating dynamic that could have easily destroyed the creative freedom and emotional vulnerability of the younger members. Yet, Jin made the conscious, incredibly selfless, and incredibly difficult decision to completely shatter that cultural hierarchy with his own two hands. He deliberately threw away his pride, his cool, sophisticated actor image, and his own massive ego to willingly become the group's resident clown, brilliantly weaponizing his ridiculous dad jokes, his iconic, exaggerated windshield wiper laugh, and his dramatic, chaotic bickering to constantly break the thick, heavy ice of their intensely stressful, high-stakes idol lives, willingly painting himself as the childish, carefree fool so that the heavy, crushing burden of leadership could be slightly lifted off RM's battered shoulders, and the younger members could breathe, laugh, make mistakes, and feel completely safe to be their authentic selves without the constant, paralyzing fear of judgment from their respected elder. However, playing the invincible, happy-go-lucky fool for a global audience is an incredibly lonely, deeply isolating role, a chilling fact that violently came to light during the surprise release of his melancholy solo track, Abyss, right before his birthday in 2020, a raw, devastating midnight confession that sent immediate shockwaves of heartbreak through the entire fandom as he finally, tearfully admitted to experiencing a massive, paralyzing burnout and a severe, crippling bout of imposter syndrome, right at the absolute dizzying peak of BTS's historic Billboard Hot 100 success with their mega hit Dynamite. In a deeply vulnerable, heart-wrenching letter to the fans, Jin revealed that while the entire world was loudly congratulating them for miraculously conquering the global music industry, his own heart felt like a dark, freezing, bottomless ocean, entirely suffocating under the heavy, agonizing thought that he fundamentally did not deserve the overwhelming applause. Looking around at his immensely talented members and genuinely wondering why he was standing next to them, receiving such monumental praise when he felt he lacked so much true artistry, he bravely stripped away the perfectly curated worldwide handsome mask to show us a very fragile man, drowning in his own profound insecurities, seeking professional psychological counseling just to mentally process the immense crushing guilt of his own unprecedented astronomical success, proving once and for all that the brightest, loudest smiles often conceal the darkest, most terrifying inner demons that nobody else can see. Let us also never forget the monumental, culturally shifting era of his solo song, Epiphany, where he was tasked to stand completely alone on massive stadium stages, sometimes playing a grand piano with artificial rain literally pouring down on his soaking wet shoulders, singing a breathtaking, almost cruel, beautiful ballad about finally learning to love himself in this harsh world, a profound, almost cruel irony, considering that behind those soaring silver vocals that critics later praised as the emotional beating core of BTS, he was actively fighting a daily, brutal, silent war against his own deeply entrenched self-doubt, standing under the blinding spotlight, acting as the ultimate flawless beacon of self-love for millions of desperate fans, while secretly struggling behind closed doors to find a single valid reason to love the exhausted artist he saw in the mirror every morning. We often see him aggressively gaming for hours on end, obsessively playing MapleStory, or quietly going on solitary fishing trips, and we collectively treat it as a cute, quirky hobby of an eccentric millionaire. But psychologists and keen observers might argue that this intense, laser-focused dive into a virtual, controllable fantasy world, or the dead silence of the open sea, is a desperate, vital survival tactic for a man whose real life is scrutinized under a relentless, terrifying global microscope where one single wrong move, one misplaced word, or one bad note could jeopardize the entire multi-billion-dollar empire he sacrificed his youth to help build. He is the quiet, observant protector, the one who silently drove a teenage Jungkook to school and attended his graduations, the one who cooked massive, hearty meals for the starving, exhausted trainees in their cramped, roach-infested early dorms, using his own limited personal allowance, the true, unsung maternal and paternal figure wrapped into one incredible human being who essentially sacrificed his own wild 20s to raise 6 lost boys into untouchable global superstars, never once demanding the credit, the center stage, or the spotlight for his invisible, exhausting emotional labor. And when the inescapable, dreaded, and terrifying reality of mandatory military service finally came knocking forcefully at their door, threatening to tear the legendary group apart and permanently derail their historic, unstoppable momentum, it was of course Jin who stepped up without a second of hesitation to take the very first terrifying bullet for his brothers, bravely walking away from the blinding, comfortable spotlight and straight into the freezing, unforgiving winter of the frontline military training camp all by himself, quietly absorbing the intense public scrutiny, the chaotic media circus, and the overwhelming, deeply human fear of the total unknown, so that his younger brothers wouldn't have to face the initial brutal brunt of that harsh reality. He turned his newly buzzed haircut into a light-hearted joke on the internet.
Number 4. Suga. The rapper who starved for his art, the shattered shoulder in the rain, the bleeding soul behind the savage genius. When you look into the sharp, piercing, feline eyes of Min Yoongi, globally worshipped as Suga and fiercely revered in the underground as August D, you immediately see the intimidating, untouchable musical genius of BTS, the brutally honest, savage lyricist who confidently silences his massive roster of haters with a single devastating smirk and a microphone drop. The prolific, hit-making producer locked inside his legendary Genius Lab, generating multi-million-dollar tracks that top the Billboard charts week after week. But what happens when you furiously scrape away that impenetrable, icy exterior of hip-hop bravado to reveal a deeply traumatized, bleeding young boy from Daegu who literally had to choose between eating a cheap bowl of noodles and taking the 2-hour bus ride home? We have to drastically strip away the glittering diamonds, the sold-out stadium tours, and the designer suits to travel back to a desperately dark, suffocatingly poor chapter of his life, where a young, fiercely ambitious Yoongi was hustling in the gritty, unforgiving underground rap scene under the moniker Gloss, desperately trying to sell his self-produced beats just to survive, constantly getting viciously scammed by older, manipulative musicians who happily took his hard work and paid him absolutely nothing, leaving him wandering the freezing, neon-lit streets of his hometown with an empty stomach and a heart full of burning, unadulterated rage against an unfair world. Imagine the sheer, crushing psychological weight of pursuing a dangerous, wildly uncertain dream of music while your own parents violently oppose your very existence as an artist, tearing up your precious handwritten lyric books and throwing them away because they were terrified of their sons starving to death in a notoriously ruthless industry. A heartbreakingly realistic fear that forced Yoongi to essentially run away from home and move to the massive, alienating city of Seoul with nothing but a few ragged clothes and a desperate, suffocating desire to prove everyone wrong. When he finally signed with the incredibly small, nearly bankrupt Big Hit Entertainment as a producer and a trainee, the financial reality was so devastatingly grim that the company couldn't even afford to feed or house their trainees properly, forcing Yoongi to take on a dangerous, exhausting part-time job as a motorcycle delivery boy just to pay his own crippling tuition fees, weaving through the chaotic, rain-slicked traffic of Seoul late at night, while the other members were safely asleep in their cramped dorm.
And then the absolute unthinkable happened. A terrifying, bone-crushing collision in the dead of night, an intersection crash that sent him violently flying off his motorcycle, leaving him lying in the cold, wet asphalt, staring up at the unforgiving sky with a completely shattered, agonizingly dislocated shoulder, a brutal physical trauma that would permanently alter the course of his entire life. But here is the most devastating, heartbreaking twist of this entire horrifying ordeal. Instead of rushing to the hospital and demanding the urgent medical care he desperately needed, an absolutely terrified Yoongi made the chilling, desperate decision to hide his catastrophic injury from the company, completely convinced that if the management found out he was damaged goods, they would immediately terminate his contract and throw his shattered dreams into the trash, choosing instead to quietly bind his agonizingly painful shoulder with cheap tape, swallowing handfuls of over-the-counter painkillers and dragging his broken, screaming body into the dance studio every single day to violently execute grueling, high-impact hip-hop choreographies with one arm essentially dead, a horrific, silent martyrdom that he endured for almost 8 agonizing years. This relentless, suffocating physical pain was intimately paralleled by a massive, terrifying psychological darkness that threatened to swallow him entirely. A brutal, exhausting war against crippling depression, severe obsessive-compulsive disorder, and a paralyzing social phobia that he finally, bravely confessed to the entire world in his raw, unapologetic, and completely unfiltered solo masterpiece, The Last, where he aggressively rapped about locking himself in public bathrooms, sleeping on cold, dirty floors, and staring blankly into the sterile walls of a psychiatric ward, deeply hating the broken man he saw in the mirror, while simultaneously terrified of the massive, monstrous beast of fame he was rapidly becoming. We constantly label him as the cold, uncaring, savage member of the group, a lazy grandfather who just wants to be reborn as a rock in his next life. But in stark reality, Min Yoongi is the ultimate heartbreaking definition of its tsundere, the profoundly observant, deeply sensitive, silent protector who quietly buys water for the younger members without looking at them, who meticulously cooks massive, hearty meals for the group while they play, who steps in to fix everything that RM accidentally breaks, and who famously sent incredibly long, emotionally devastating text messages ending with the words "I love you" to a deeply struggling Taehyung and Jungkook, completely shattering their world and bringing them to violent tears because they knew exactly how much agonizing effort it took for him to lower his massive defensive walls. Let us never, ever forget the historically monumental, tear-drenched night at their 2016 epilogue concert, a moment that is permanently scorched into the hearts of millions when Yoongi was scanning the massive, screaming crowd and finally locked eyes with his parents and his brother, the very people who had violently opposed his dream and told him he would fail, who had finally, beautifully surrendered to his success and were sitting in the audience proudly, causing this incredibly tough, unbreakable underground rapper to instantly drop to his knees on the hard stage floor, burying his face in his trembling hands and bowing to them while sobbing so uncontrollably, so violently, that his entire body shook with the massive, crushing release of years of agonizing guilt, desperate yearning, and the desperate need for his family's simple validation. Fast forward to the creation of his recent agonizingly raw music video for Amygdala, where he literally slices open his own deeply buried traumas for the world to see, desperately begging the fear center of his brain to erase the horrifying memories of his mother's heart surgery, his father's battle with cancer, and his own terrifying motorcycle crash, proving to us that the multi-millionaire global superstar we see today is still actively, painfully fighting the terrified, bleeding delivery boy from Seoul every single time he closes his eyes to sleep.
The excruciating, undeniable truth about number 4 is that Min Yoongi literally sold his youth, his physical health, and his own sanity to a brutal industry just so he could afford to breathe, transforming his profound, crippling trauma into a desperately needed musical sanctuary that has actively saved the lives of millions of suicidal, depressed, and hopeless fans across the entire globe, all while quietly refusing to ask for anyone to save him in return, leaving us completely breathless and forced to ask the devastating question: when the genius producer who painstakingly heals the bleeding wounds of the entire world with his powerful lyrics finally takes off his headphones and sits in the deafening, echoing silence of his studio, who is there to apply pressure to his own bleeding soul?
Number 3. Jimin. The swan who starved for perfection. The angel with bloody feet. The brutal mirror of self-hatred. When the ethereal, impossibly graceful figure of Park Jimin glides across a massive stadium stage, executing gravity-defying contemporary spins with blinding elegance and hitting celestial, glass-shattering high notes that seem to effortlessly pierce the heavens, the entire world immediately stops to worship at the altar of his undeniable, mesmerizing talent. But what happens when the blinding stadium lights finally switch off and the mesmerizing black swan of BTS is left completely alone, aggressively staring into a cold, unforgiving dressing room mirror, violently picking apart every single microscopic flaw in his reflection until his own mind becomes a suffocating, inescapable torture chamber? We have to violently rip away the glittering sequined Chanel jackets and the flawless angelic makeup to travel back to the gritty, sweat-stained floors of the big hit entertainment practice rooms, where a desperately anxious, chubby-cheeked teenager from Busan was actively fighting the most terrifying, cutthroat battle for his literal survival. Before the unprecedented global domination, Jimin was an undisputed once-in-a-generation prodigy, the absolute top-ranking student at the highly prestigious Busan High School of Arts, a boy whose breathtaking contemporary dance skills were so undeniably profound that his own furious teachers desperately begged him not to throw his guaranteed glittering future away for the incredibly risky, highly stigmatized, and notoriously brutal K-pop idol industry. Imagine the sheer, crushing psychological weight of abandoning everything you know, packing your bags, and moving to a massive, alienating city like Seoul, only to be violently thrust into a hip-hop group where your elegant, fluid, balletic movements were suddenly considered a massive, glaring liability instead of a unique asset. Jimin was given the absolute shortest trainee period out of all the 7 members, a chaotic, terrifyingly brief 6 months where he was constantly, relentlessly hovering on the absolute razor's edge of elimination. A devastating reality where he was actively almost kicked out of the final BTS debut lineup in agonizing 8 separate times, constantly being told by ruthless executives that his unique aura simply did not fit the aggressive, gritty, dark hip-hop concept the group was desperately trying to project. Because he was so completely consumed by the paralyzing, sickening fear of having his dreams ripped away at the very last second and being sent back to Busan as a humiliating failure, Jimin mutated his natural ambition into a brutal, terrifying obsession with absolute flawless perfection, sleeping a mere 2 to 3 hours a night in the filthy studio, aggressively practicing the exact same robotic pop-and-lock hip-hop routines until his muscles violently cramped, his bare feet literally bled through his socks, and he frequently collapsed onto the cold, hard wood from sheer, unadulterated physical exhaustion. But the true horrifying nightmare of number 3 fundamentally lies in his deeply tragic, heavily documented battle with severe body image issues and a truly terrifying self-destructive diet culture that actively threatened to destroy his health completely. A dark, hidden secret that reached its absolute horrifying peak during the legendary Blood, Sweat, and Tears era when BTS was finally exploding into the global mainstream.
While millions of fans across the entire world were screaming and fiercely praising his breathtaking, sculpted visuals and his razor-sharp jawline, Jimin was secretly enduring a literal self-imposed hell on earth, starving his own young body by ruthlessly restricting himself to just one single meal in 10 days, frantically exercising until his vision went completely black and he would violently pass out during their grueling high-intensity dance practices, completely ignoring the desperate, tearful pleas of his older member Jin, who forcefully tried to make him eat, and aggressively refusing to listen to his own body's agonizing screams for nourishment, simply because he was completely convinced he looked fat and inadequate next to his fiercely talented brothers. This sickening, heartbreaking level of self-hatred is a terrifying paradox for a man who was globally worshipped as the ultimate comforting fairy of the group, the deeply empathetic, hyper-aware emotional anchor who instantly rushes across the stage to tightly embrace a crying Taeyoung, the soft, warm presence who gently strokes a sobbing Jungkook's hair, and the selfless angel who constantly, unconditionally pours every single ounce of his own emotional energy into healing the deep psychological wounds of the other 6 members without ever once asking for anything in return. Yet when it comes to his own immense vocal talent and his breathtaking stage performances, he is his own most vicious, unforgiving enemy. There are multiple, agonizingly raw behind-the-scenes documentaries that show Jimin completely breaking down in violent, uncontrollable tears under the dark stage, fiercely punching his own thighs in sheer frustration and locking himself inside tiny, claustrophobic bathroom stalls for hours simply because his voice cracked for 1 microsecond or his earpiece malfunctioned during a live concert, heavily beating himself up over invisible mistakes that the massive screaming audience didn't even notice. The crushing, suffocating weight of being the lead vocalist who handles all the impossible lung-busting high notes while simultaneously serving as the main dancer, executing the most physically demanding acrobatic choreographies, is an incredibly dangerous high-wire balancing act that constantly leaves his vocal cords inflamed, his muscles torn, and his mind trapped in a vicious, endless cycle of crippling imposter syndrome. It wasn't until the historically profound, highly emotional surprise release of his first self-composed solo acoustic track, Promise, that the entire world finally understood the true, terrifying depth of his internal darkness. He tearfully confessed to his massive fandom that he originally began writing the song as a dark, aggressive curse directed entirely at himself, a vicious manifestation of his own deep-seated self-loathing. But after a deeply profound late-night conversation with RM, he completely rewrote the lyrics into a desperate, heartbreaking plea for survival, begging his own fractured soul to stop throwing himself away and to finally become his own comforting light in a terrifying dark world. He is the mesmerizing, gravity-defying artist who willingly snaps his own neck and shatters his own bones to deliver a flawless 3-minute performance that leaves the entire globe completely breathless. But the absolute devastating tragedy of Park Jimin is that he spent his entire youth desperately loving everyone else in the room while aggressively refusing to look in the mirror with an ounce of mercy, actively bleeding out on the altar of perfectionism just to prove he was worthy of the spotlight, leaving us utterly shattered and forced to ask the chilling, desperately unanswered question: when the beautiful, broken angel who dedicates his entire existence to being the safe haven and the warm, healing embrace for BTS and millions of armies finally collapses from the agonizing weight of his own unattainable standards, who was strong enough to catch him and desperately convince him that he is already and has always been more than enough?
Number 2. V. The box smile hiding a shattered soul, the misunderstood genius trapped in a masterpiece, the boy who lost his hero. when we gaze upon the breathtaking, historically unrivaled, museum-worthy visage of Kim Tae-young, globally worshipped by millions as V, we are instantly captivated by the man who was officially crowned the most handsome face on the planet, an ethereal, untouchable fashion icon who effortlessly commands the flashing cameras of Paris Fashion Week and mesmerizes massive stadium crowds with a single, devastatingly intense stare that fundamentally redefines modern beauty. But what happens when you furiously shatter that flawless CGV computer-generated exterior to reveal a profoundly misunderstood, deeply grieving country boy from Daegu who was fundamentally terrified of being forgotten by the very group that saved his life? We must violently rip away the glittering Celine jackets, the velvet suits, and the record-breaking jazz pop solos to travel back to the humble, sprawling strawberry fields of Gyeochang, where a young, innocent Tae-young genuinely believed his ultimate grand destiny was simply to become a hard-working farmer, just like his beloved grandmother who raised him, a boy completely untouched by the ruthless, cutthroat ambition of the Seoul entertainment industry, until he absent-mindedly tagged along to a big-hit entertainment audition simply to support a friend, only to be accidentally discovered by a frantic casting director who took one look at his striking, unconventional features and immediately thrust him into the brutal, terrifying trainee system. But the true, agonizing nightmare of number 2 begins with the deeply traumatic, psychologically damaging era where Big Hit made the shockingly cruel, highly controversial administrative decision to keep Tae-young completely hidden from the public eye as the group's secret weapon right up until their official debut. A devastatingly painful strategy that essentially forced an intensely social, deeply affectionate teenager into a suffocating, isolated purgatory, while the other 6 members excitedly filmed vlogs, interacted with eagerly waiting fans, and slowly built their public identities. Imagine the sheer, crushing heartbreak of sitting completely alone in the dark, cold corner of a cramped recording studio, silently watching your 6 new brothers laughing and introducing themselves to the world through a camera lens, while you are strictly forbidden from uttering a single word, heavily burdened by the paralyzing, suffocating fear that the company might suddenly change their minds and viciously cut you from the final lineup without the public ever even knowing you existed, a deeply ingrained, agonizing insecurity that forced him to write countless desperate letters to the other members that he was never allowed to post, violently crying alone in his bed because he felt utterly invisible. And when he was finally, explosively revealed to the world, the media and the public violently misunderstood his fiercely unique, profoundly artistic soul, lazily slapping him with the derogatory, alienating 4D or alien labels simply because his brilliant mind processed the world differently, mocking his eccentricities, his blank stares, and his beautifully unconventional thought patterns, instead of taking the time to understand the deep, ocean-like complexity of a boy who saw art in everything, a painful, humiliating public mischaracterization that he actively despised and quietly fought against for years until he finally commanded the respect he deserved as a deeply serious, philosophical artist. Furthermore, the massive, blinding spotlight on his unmatched physical beauty became a terrifying double-edged sword, a golden cage where critics and even casual listeners obsessively focused entirely on his visual perfection, carelessly dismissing his profound musicality, his grueling hours spent producing in the studio, and his fierce dedication to his craft, forcing him to violently scream twice as loud just to prove he was not merely an empty, beautiful doll manufactured for mass consumption.
However, the absolute shattering climax of Kim Tae-young's hidden agony violently erupted during the historic, tear-drenched 2016 BTS muster concert at the massive Gocheck Sky Dome, a night that will forever be violently scarred into the collective memory of the entire fandom, when V bravely gripped the microphone with violently trembling hands and tearfully confessed to the massive, screaming audience that his beloved grandmother, the woman who had practically raised him for 14 years, his absolute rock and his entire universe, had suddenly passed away exactly when BTS was thousands of miles away performing in the Philippines, forcefully colliding his greatest professional triumph with his most agonizing personal tragedy. The horrifying, inescapable reality of the K-pop idol machine dictated that while his literal heart was being violently ripped out of his chest, Tae-young was contractually obligated to step onto blindingly bright stages, aggressively perform the upbeat, high-energy choreographies of blood, sweat, and tears, and flash his signature heartwarming, boxy smile to the screaming cameras, actively bleeding out on live television and swallowing his agonizing, suffocating grief just to protect the group's historic comeback, a brutal, horrifying, emotional martyrdom that perfectly illustrates the sickeningly high price of global fame. This profound, unspoken sorrow deeply saturated his massive, breathtaking solo track, Stigma, where his rich, soulful, surprisingly deep baritone voice, a uniquely dark, jazzy vocal tone that vocal coaches initially criticized for not fitting the standard high-pitched, manufactured K-pop mold, finally exploded into a desperate, glass-shattering high note, frantically apologizing to his siblings and crying out for redemption, transforming his immense, unnameable pain into a visceral sonic masterpiece that leaves listeners completely paralyzed. This relentless, crushing internal battle with his own melancholic demons aggressively resurfaced during the suffocating, terrifying peak of the global pandemic, a period of massive, unprecedented isolation that actively triggered a severe, crippling bout of burnout and profound depression for Tae-young, forcing him to desperately channel his agonizing feelings of emptiness, frustration, and terrifying numbness into the devastatingly beautiful acoustic ballad Blue and Gray, where he violently strips away the glamorous V persona to expose a deeply exhausted, desperate Kim Tae-young actively begging for a simple, warm embrace, questioning if he is fundamentally broken and fiercely longing for the innocent, happy boy he used to be before the massive, crushing weight of global superstardom completely swallowed him whole. He is the deeply sensitive, incredibly romantic soul who fiercely loves jazz, classic art, and vintage photography, the boy who famously coined the world-changing phrase, "I purple you," to express a love so vast and unconditional it transcends language itself, yet he is constantly, relentlessly forced to actively defend his own deeply guarded privacy from ruthless, invasive media spectacles and terrifying, obsessive stalkers who view him merely as a beautiful, consumable object rather than a fragile, beating human heart, a horrifying reality that actively forces him to constantly build massive, impenetrable emotional walls just to survive the blinding, suffocating glare of the global spotlight, while fiercely relying on his unbreakable, intensely emotional soulmate bond with Jimin just to keep his head above the dark water. The deeply devastating, undeniable truth about number 2 is that Kim Tae-young literally sacrificed his own right to mourn in peace, his innocent youth, and his brilliantly unique, misunderstood mind to the ruthless altar of the BTS legacy, constantly, desperately fighting to keep his pure artistic soul fully intact in an industry specifically designed to manufacture empty, hollow perfection, leaving leaving us completely breathless and forced to ask the absolute, chillingly devastating question: when the man who beautifully paints the entire world with his boundless purple love is violently trapped in a suffocating room painted entirely in cold, isolating shades of blue and gray, who is truly listening to the silent, desperate screams of Kim Tae-young?
Number 1. Jungkook. The boy who sold his youth, the golden maknae crushed under the crown, the tears of a child in a billion-dollar empire. When the deafening roar of the stadium reaches a terrifying, earth-shattering crescendo, the world universally bows down to the undisputed, untouchable prodigy known as Jungkook, the mythical golden maknae of BTS, who can sing like an absolute angel, dance like a possessed demon, rap, direct videos, paint masterpieces, and effortlessly conquer the global Billboard charts with a single mesmerizing breath. But what happens when the blinding, suffocating gold plating finally chips away to reveal a profoundly exhausted, permanently scarred young boy who literally never had the chance to grow up? We must violently rewind the clock to a terrifyingly vulnerable time when a painfully shy, doe-eyed 15-year-old child practically ran away from his humble life in Busan, desperately boarding a train to the massive, terrifying metropolis of Seoul with absolutely nothing but a ridiculously oversized backpack and an impossible dream, essentially handing over his entire unlived youth to big hit entertainment and 6 older, equally terrified strangers who would ultimately have to raise him in a cramped, roach-infested dorm room. Imagine the sheer, crushing psychological horror of being thrust into the brutal, unforgiving meat grinder of the K-pop industry before your brain has even fully developed. A terrifying reality where this quiet, introverted kid who used to violently cry and refuse to sing when asked by his vocal coaches was suddenly tasked with carrying the immense, crushing expectations of a dying company on his incredibly fragile teenage shoulders. The world constantly, obsessively praises him for being perfectly good at absolutely everything he touches, lazily throwing around the golden title as if it is a magical, effortless genetic gift, completely and maliciously ignoring the agonizing, sweat-drenched reality that Jungkook essentially beat himself into absolute submission, aggressively spending thousands of sleepless nights in the suffocating dance studios until his knees violently gave out and his lungs burned with the taste of blood, absolutely terrified of disappointing the 6 older brothers who sacrificed their own food and money to keep him alive. But the absolute devastating tragedy of number 1 fundamentally lies in the heartbreaking, inescapable fact that Jungkook essentially possesses no core identity outside of BTS, a chilling, profound realization that he tearfully confessed in his agonizingly raw solo track Begin, where he violently broke down in the recording studio, sobbing uncontrollably as he admitted to RM that he feels absolutely no physical or mental pain when his own body is exhausted, but watching his Hyung suffer in silence completely shatters his mental state and tears his heart to absolute shreds. He essentially absorbed the distinct personalities, the unique vocal habits, the specific mannerisms, and the profound, lingering traumas of RM, Jin, Suga, J-Hope, Jimin, and V, completely molding his entire existence into a beautiful, fragmented mirror reflecting the 6 men who raised him, a deeply profound psychological dependence that left him utterly terrified and paralyzed with crippling imposter syndrome when he finally had to stand alone for his historic, record-breaking solo album Golden, desperately questioning if the world would still love him if he wasn't standing perfectly shielded behind his members.
Furthermore, the relentless, suffocating global spotlight transformed his deeply personal, completely natural coming-of-age journey into a terrifying, highly scrutinized public spectacle where every single minor mistake, every dropped item, every spontaneous tattoo he etched onto his skin to reclaim a tiny sliver of control over his own closely monitored body, and every secret piercing he got in a desperate attempt to rebel against the suffocating, innocent baby image forcibly imposed upon him by the industry and the fans, was immediately, viciously dissected, condemned, and torn apart by millions of relentless keyboard-wielding critics across the globe. Do you remember the terrifying, deeply traumatic era where the internet maliciously hunted him down for simply hanging out with friends during his private vacation time, launching a massive, coordinated witch hunt that completely shattered his fragile trust in the world and forced him to issue a deeply humiliating, agonizingly unnecessary public apology just to stop the relentless bleeding, proving once again that the global music industry views him not as a breathing, feeling human being who deserves basic privacy, but as a shiny, highly profitable commodity that they completely own. He is the boy who bravely, boldly stood on the massive, terrifying stage of the FIFA World Cup, singing about dreamers while actively suppressing his own immense, paralyzing performance anxiety. The fiercely loyal, desperately loving soul who literally tattooed the word army across his knuckles so that his fans would be the very first thing he sees every time he holds a microphone. A permanent, agonizingly beautiful devotion that constantly ties him to the very entity that gives him life while simultaneously suffocating his freedom. Let us never, ever forget the historically devastating, gut-wrenching moment during the 2018 Mama Awards, where Jin shockingly revealed that the group had heavily considered disbanding due to severe, crippling mental exhaustion, and the camera violently panned to a heavily sobbing, completely broken Jungkook, who essentially collapsed into Taehyung's arms, weeping with such intense, raw agony because the terrifying thought of losing the only family, the only life, and the only identity he had ever known was a psychological blow he simply could not survive. And when the crushing weight of global isolation during the pandemic hit, it was Jungkook who retreated into the darkest corners of his own mind, broadcasting live streams in the dead of night, desperately singing for hours to millions of anonymous faces, simply because the terrifying, deafening silence of his own massive, empty apartment was entirely too much for his incredibly fragile heart to bear, actively using his unparalleled vocal talent not to entertain, but desperately to anchor himself to a reality that felt like it was violently slipping away. We watch him aggressively push his physical limits during chaotic live concerts, refusing to step off the stage even when he is actively requiring an oxygen tank backstage, violently pushing past the agonizing limits of human endurance because he genuinely believes that if he gives anything less than 1,000,000%, he will instantly lose the conditional love of the world that he has sacrificed his entire human existence to earn. The deeply devastating, undeniable truth about number one is that Jungkook literally sold his childhood, his right to make private mistakes, and his entire personal freedom to a multi-billion-dollar empire just so he could be the flawless, unbreakable golden sword for his 6 brothers, fiercely, relentlessly absorbing the massive, terrifying blows of global superstardom so they wouldn't have to face the darkness alone, constantly smiling his bright bunny smile to desperately hide the exhausted, terrified boy inside, leaving us completely breathless, profoundly shattered, and forced to ask the absolute, ultimate, devastating question when the magnificent golden child, who literally sacrificed his entire human existence to carry the massive, crushing weight of the BTS legacy, finally collapses in the deafening, isolating silence of his empty hotel room. Who is there to gently hold the fiercely weeping 15-year-old boy who is still desperately, endlessly trapped in the body of an untouchable global king?
And there you have it,
The raw, unfiltered, and heartbreaking reality hiding just beneath the flawless, glittering surface of the biggest boy band in the history of the world. A devastatingly beautiful paradox where the 7 individuals who have dedicated their entire existence to healing the deep psychological wounds of millions across the globe are secretly, constantly battling their own suffocating inner demons in the deafening silence of their empty hotel rooms. When you truly step back and look at the colossal, multi-billion-dollar empire they have built, you realize it wasn't just constructed with catchy pop melodies, perfectly synchronized hip-hop choreographies, and record-breaking cinematic music videos, but it was painstakingly forged through literal blood, sweat, agonizing tears, crushed shoulders, starved bodies, and the permanent, heartbreaking sacrifice of 7 innocent childhoods that can never, ever be returned to them. For those who have spent countless days, weeks, or even years deeply immersing themselves in this massive musical universe, analyzing every single profound lyric and passionately celebrating every historic triumph on the charts, this dark, profound revelation entirely shatters the shiny, manufactured idol illusion and forces us to confront the heavy, agonizing human cost of their unprecedented global fame. We constantly demand absolute, unyielding perfection from them every single second they are on camera, eagerly consuming their content, their music, and their bright manufactured smiles as if it is our fundamental right. But how often do we actually stop to consider the terrifying, suffocating weight of the heavy, jewel-encrusted crowns that the music industry and the world violently forced onto their fragile heads? RM completely gave up his carefree youth to be the unbreakable intellectual shield. Jin deliberately sacrificed his own massive ego and serious actor dreams to become the healing, chaotic fool. Suga traded his physical health and mental sanity to produce life-saving art from his deepest traumas. J-Hope completely rewired his artistic soul and buried his own shadows to be a perpetual sun for everyone else. Jimin brutally starved his own body in a desperate, agonizing pursuit of impossible visual and vocal perfection. Taihang violently locked away his unique, grieving, deeply misunderstood heart to protect the group's flawless public image, and Jungkook, the ultimate golden sacrifice, entirely surrendered his human identity to absorb the heavy collective traumas of his 6 older brothers because he fundamentally doesn't know how to exist without them. They are not just manufactured plastic pop stars dancing for our endless entertainment. They are profoundly scarred, incredibly resilient survivors of a ruthless, cutthroat K-pop machine that actively consumes young, desperate dreamers and spits them out as hollow, highly profitable commodities. Yet these 7 men miraculously, beautifully held on to each other's bleeding hands in the darkest of times and stubbornly refused to let go, choosing instead to turn their immense, unnameable pain into a profound global message of radical self-love and desperate hope for a generation that desperately needed saving. The next time you watch them perform under those blinding stadium lights, effortlessly defying gravity and flashing those brilliant, dazzling smiles that can instantly cure a bad day, look a little closer at the subtle, hidden shadows deep within their eyes. Recognize the sheer, unimaginable, bone-crushing willpower it takes for them to simply stand there and be the invincible heroes the entire world aggressively demands them to be. And ask yourself one final, chilling, unavoidable question. Now that the glamorous masks have been violently ripped away and the devastating hidden truths of all 7 members have been entirely exposed, will you still endlessly demand them to be flawless, untouchable gods, or will you finally, truly allow them the simple, desperate grace of just being beautifully, tragically human? Let me know in the comments below which member's hidden struggle completely shattered your heart the most, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button if you are brave enough to uncover more dark, hidden truths behind the blinding lights of the entertainment industry. Because here, we never stop digging for the reality they desperately want to keep buried.